Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the Musings from the Mount podcast, where we explore the intersection of spirituality, psychology, and global consciousness. I'm your host, Joseph Carenza. In today's episode, we're diving into the fascinating world of national psyches. We ask the question, what if countries had souls? What if understanding these souls could help us navigate global challenges and foster world peace? Join me and Michael Lindfield as we unpack these provocative ideas and explore how viewing nations as living entities could transform our approach to global citizenship. Let's begin our journey into the hidden spiritual DNA of nations. We hope you enjoyed the episode. And if you do enjoy this podcast, please consider going to meditationmount.org and donating. Your donation helps us to bring you this podcast, as well as all the other programs the Mount produces, both today and in the future. We are incredibly grateful and honored by your support. All right, on with the podcast. If we look at the rise and fall of nations, we notice in the same way that the weather has cycles. The seasons have cycles. It seems like the nations have cycles. Empires have cycles. We also can look at the ray makeup, the seven rays of each civilization, each people, each country, and we can see how they play against each other. And this sort of dance between these nations and the soul character of these nations. How do we make sense of that? And how do we look at the rise and fall of a people or an idea and not see it as necessarily tragic or triumphant, but rather part of a system that is continual and evolving,
Oh, this is a great question to open a door to a huge exploration, Joey. It's really what we're here to do.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back to a seed was planted called humanity, and inside of humanity it said we contain the full promise of everything. And over time, this seed has to be placed in the right growing conditions. It has to germinate. It has to be quickened. It has to grow. It has to go through all its different stages before it can flower. And we touched on this before, that we're still a few seasons away from the full flowering of our humanity. So if I look at where we are and the whole notion of the rise and fall, I think it's a great way of describing it, because we talk about the tides. There's always this ebb and flow of the tides.
Mm.
And one thing that we've always emphasized in these podcasts is that life is eternal. The indwelling life is eternal, while its myriad forms of expression are temporal, which is what we talked about with incarnation. Mm-hmm. The soul incarnates, it takes on flesh, and then it's called birth. It enters these realms of time and space. And when it's time to recycle or upcycle, it returns to the subtle world, which is still a world of form, but it's a world of subtle form. So what we have is this continuous sort of cycling through the portals of birth and death at an individual level. But what you're posing now is, what does it look like as a civilization? Mm-hmm. There are many people who have read The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire.
Right.
And you can say, well, what was it that caused it to rise? Well, if you step back, the creative impulse behind any culture or civilization is called a mythos. Its mythos is its seed impulse, and this seed impulse contains the particular promise for the coming epoch. And this, as I just said, is part of the continuous pageant of human evolution. So the Roman Empire, or the Roman civilization, had inside it a promise to fulfill. And then when you fulfill that promise, just as the Greeks did, you reach a golden age through science, through art, through philosophy, through the way you govern yourselves. And then once you've reached your zenith, once you've reached all that you can achieve this incarnation, basically the rot sets in.
Right.
And it starts to decompose. First of all, you have the composition. You start to compose. And then the decompose. And we could look at this in so many different ways. But what I want to say is that if you look at these civilizations as waves breaking on this timeless shore, before each new cultural wave breaks on the shore of human consciousness, there's a period of great confusion and chaos. Because you've got these time-honored social and philosophical models that no longer seem to serve. They don't meet the needs anymore. And therefore, because they don't have that integrity, they don't have that ability to serve, they begin to crumble. And we talked about this before, is that when things start to crumble, you've got the destructive period, which is clearing a space for the new. And the new would be the new seed impulse. And we've looked at this at a personal level in our own lives, in our own incarnations, that the challenges we face are there to test us to step up to the next level. It calls out striving. It calls out all the patterns that are standing in the way. It helps us break free from the gravitational pull of matter, whether you're looking at this through the Buddhist eyes of non-attachment, whether you're looking at freeing yourself from addictions, whether they be physical, emotional, or mental addictions, you're hooked on something. But let's step back and just say the Roman Empire, the Greek civilization, they all had their golden age, and then they started to decompose. So in a moment, I'd like to look at what creates this virtuous upward rising spiral that allows a civilization to reach its zenith, its golden age. And then, what is it that seems to be released that causes its downfall? Right. So we could look at the virtues and the vices.
Right.
And I'd like to place those in a very, very different context. Well, maybe we could do that now, because we've used this idea of mythos. Mythos is the seed that is planted inside the soil of each civilization. If you think of a soil needing nutrients, you think of the virtues as being the nutrients. And therefore you have a very rich, fertile, alive, bacteria-rich soil. And therefore you can flower. The seed impulse, the mythos, can flower. And then it reaches a point where you've done all you can this incarnation, this civilization. And then what starts to take over are the things that still have to be redeemed. Therefore, the vices come in. So you look, for instance, at the fall of the Roman Empire. Joey, what would you say contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire?
I mean, it's interesting because I was thinking about the Greeks though when you were talking about that.
Okay,
and I was going to say because we have a more idyllic view of the Greek, but then if you actually study any kind of Greek history, you realize, okay, there was vast amounts of inequality right there. So there was slavery. Women were basically a non-factor, and there was it wasn't a caste system like they have in India, but there was definitely a caste system in terms of where you were on the social hierarchy. And so what I was thinking of is foundations. So that align perfectly with what you were saying. You have this soil, you have this this space, this epoch, or a batch or a cycle in which to grow as high and wide and beautiful as you can. But if your foundation is shaky, and that foundation in the case of the Greeks was, these vast inequalities, you could only grow so high,
Right.
And so then if you take that to the Roman Empire, I mean, it's writ large. I mean, like there was as far one way you could go, they were also going the other way. It was everything at once, And but I mean, there's also some argument to say that the Roman Empire never ended. It's just now the world. The world is the Roman Empire. I mean, the American Empire is just a continuation. The British Empire was a continuation. The Holy Roman Empire was a continuation. So you could look at that as a constantly evolving thing. And even so, you could say the Greek Empire grew into the Roman. It's a continually evolve. But if you just think of it as cycles, I think it's more interesting to look at it like that.
Well, they're incarnational cycles, and you carry over from one cycle to another cycle all your virtues, all the accumulations, as the Buddhists would say, the chalice, all the things you've generated, all your virtues, and you also carry forward all the unredeemed aspects, the patterns that still have to be worked out. So in that respect, there is continuity. One does flow into the other. And therefore, what we're seeing now is a continuation of that, if you like, the Roman Empire. It's a great way of looking at it, because in very simplistic terms, you could look at the downfall of the Roman Empire is when, licentiousness or whatever, you've got the 7 deadly sins. And for those listening who are not familiar with the 7 deadly sins, they are lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, and pride. And those were sort of celebrated in the Roman Empire. I mean, they would gorge themselves and then throw up in order to eat more. I mean, it got to the point where they were manifesting and practicing and building actual physical places where the 7 deadly sins could act out. But the virtues, if you go back, once again, these are biblical references. These 7 deadly sins were referenced in the Bible, but I think they're timeless. They also have 7 virtues. And once again, going back to a biblical reference, you could say the 7 virtues listed in the Bible are chastity, temperance, charity, which is love, diligence, patience, kindness, and humility. So you go back to this thing. These are the nutrients in the soil that allow for the flowering of the potential. And then when it's reached its potential, it can't get any higher because that's all it could achieve. And therefore, when something has reached its zenith, reached its fullness, it has to decompose in order to go through another cycle in another season and reach a greater height. So we've looked at this before, Joey, that the evolution of consciousness is this progressive entry into greater states of knowing, awareness, being. You're always expanding from where you were before. And where you end up still is only a partial rendering of what is possible, because it takes many, many seasons for the promise of our humanity to flower. And we've got a few civilizations left to perfect this. We talked about Pacificus, which is the next one. This is the era of peace, when intuition and this whole notion of the togetherness is going to be the foundation. You talked about foundations. So there are lots of other virtues that we could go into, but I think the most important thing to understand, because what's happening right now on the planet, this week, today, is incredibly unsettling for people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Because it is being unsettled.
Yeah, the shaking the snow globe around,
Yes.
That's for sure.
Well, not only the shaking of the snow globe, somebody just dropped it and it smashed on the floor. So it doesn't even have a container for its cycles. It's extreme weather. And that's the thing. You can only have an alchemical process if you have a crucible.
Then that's a very important point, because you look at, something that's fascinating to me is just the whole Dark Ages or Middle Ages. It's like if it didn't have a crucible, it didn't have a space in which to grow. Everything was scattered and sort of smashed and had to coalesce and rebuild again.
But what happened during the Dark Ages? What happens in the darkness? A point of light is preserved in a secret place.
Right.
So you've got the sacred island of Iona. That was this where the light was hidden and kept. You've got different places around the world where the light is hidden and kept during the winter months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
During the winter of our discontent.
Well, it's also interesting, as soon as I said that, I always have that counter voice in my head going, but what about, so there's also tons of scholarship. If you look back at people who are writing contemporaneously during that period, they all thought they were on the cutting edge. I mean, they thought that we live in the most glorious time, we're on the cutting edge of technology. So they didn't view it as the Dark Ages. We're only looking at it as Dark Ages in retrospect. So, I have to give that as
it was the Dark Ages because the light of spirit wasn't the flame or the torch that was held high for society.
Mm-hmm.
It was a feudal system.
Yeah.
It was, as you said with the Greeks, it was gross inequality, serfdom, feudalism, which is really the denigration of the sovereignty of our humanity. Thraldom, enslavement. It goes back to what does it mean to truly be enslaved?
Mm-hmm.
It means that your spirit is not free. Therefore, the whole movement now is liberation.
Yeah.
What's happening on the planet at the moment is this cry for liberation. And some people want to be free by having no rules at all.
Mm-hmm.
Other people want to be free by rallying around somebody who promises them security, and they'll give up their freedom for security. We know that famous quote.
Yes.
But at the heart of it, liberation is how the spirit makes sure that it is never encased in matter for longer than is necessary. That's the whole mystery of the resurrection, the crucifixion and the resurrection of light, which is played out in the story in the Bible. But we're going beyond the Bible story. We're saying that this is the whole thing of, can you place the light of spirit in the densest form of matter possible on this planet, and can it resurrect? Can it reappear? Can it burst free, and not only burst free from the prison of matter, but can release the light of matter itself? And therefore, each civilization is part of the age of enlightenment. It's another luminous epoch that adds to the ever-growing luminosity of the human spirit over the civilizational cycles. So if we want to, we should probably ground this and anchor this, because this is really up in the sky. So one of the things that we're familiar with here at Meditation Mount is the notion of synthesis, of how at some point in your own individual life you need to integrate yourself. You could put all your parts together so they create a wholeness, because it's only a whole container that can receive the outpouring of spirit.
Right.
You don't pour liquid into a broken cup.
Yeah.
That is the Holy Grail. You're looking or reforging the broken chalice. We have to create a chalice to receive the outpouring of our own spirit. And we know, because we were blessed with the spiritual psychology founded by Dr. Roberto Assagioli, who's the inspiration behind Meditation Mount. He developed a psychology called psychosynthesis. And psychosynthesis honors the whole person, and it seeks to align and integrate, if you like, the multidimensional levels of self. It brings soul and personality into greater resonant relationship, so that our innate gifts, our innate qualities that constitute who we truly are, they can be experienced and expressed. So psychosynthesis is a way of supporting the evolution of consciousness and moving into, as we said just now, greater states of wholeness and self-realization. So you can look at this as an individual journey, like you and I are going through our own process of integration. And it's always these two verbs, integrate and align. You integrate yourself so you're not fractured, all your pieces are together, all your pixels are making up one picture, and then you align. You align with a deeper purpose, so that your form is aligned up with the indwelling life. What Roberto Assagioli dreamed of was the synthesis of nations. Because he saw how a civilization before was like, we talked about the Greek civilization, the Roman, well now it's a collective civilization because all the nations know each other. There isn't a part of the world that is in darkness. Mm-hmm. We know what's going on in the world 24/7.
Yeah, that's something, at least in recorded history, we have no context for, and it's finally
this
there.
This is new.
Yeah.
So we have, if you like, a global civilization for the first time. Mm-hmm. So he believed that just as in order to have a harmonious family or a harmonious community, the individuals inside it have to get their act together. He saw this vision of a synthesis of nations where the nations have to get their act together. They have to understand who they are. And this is a quote from Dr. Assagioli. He said, the psychosynthesis of each nation must precede that between the nations, just as the psychosynthesis of the individual must precede its harmonious integration into the various human groups. Disharmonious individuals cannot form harmonic groups. And the same is true of nations. This doesn't require demonstration. So that was what he's saying. Look, each nation, in order to have a world that works together, has to work on itself, just as we repeatedly are sort of stating here that we have to do the work on our own ecosystem of self, to bring it into wholeness, to bring it into harmony and order. And then we join with others to form a greater harmony, whether it's the Bodhisanga, the community of the Buddha, whether it's the beloved community of Martin Luther King. However we describe it, it has to start with the integration of the individual. So Assagioli was really clear because he said the psychosynthesis between nations is an urgent need. Because his position was there is no such thing as an isolated individual. Anybody detached from close and multiple relationships with other individuals and human groups. There is no such thing as an isolated individual. It's an illusion. So he said there are no isolated and self-sufficient nations. You can't cut yourself off. Before it was splendid isolation in the time of Disraeli in England.
Right.
Now we have another version of that at the moment in America where it's focusing on making the part great. Mm-hmm. And rather than making the world healthy. So psychosynthesis between nations actually presents a lot of difficulties. And it's the same difficulties that hinder cooperation between individuals. So let's look at what is it that stops people working together, and then what is it that stops nations working together? And they're really those that derive from what Assagioli calls the backward psychological evolutionary stage of the person or the national entity. So he calls nations national entities because they are living beings. And I'd like to get into that in a moment and look at each nation. We'll take a selection of nations and look at them as living beings with a soul, with a personality, with a particular color, as you indicated at the beginning of the podcast, qualified by a different ray, and then see how the relationships work out. But first of all, each nation has to integrate and be aligned with its own soul. It has to be whole unto itself. So one of the greatest difficulties, Assagioli says, for the harmonious synthesis between nations, and he said, indeed, one of the greatest dangers that threatens world peace is the strong tendency towards self-affirmation and consequent aggressiveness. If I assert myself, it means I assert myself over something else. Mm-hmm. And if it's over something else, I'm in a competitive mode. Mm-hmm. So he said the most effective means to use towards transformation and sublimation from material and hostile self-affirmation. There can be self-affirmation in a positive way where you're reinforcing the inner self, your inner confidence. But he calls this hostile self-affirmation, how do you transform that into a psychological and spiritual self-affirmation? So he said, a nation can fully satisfy its desire for prestige completely independently of the size of its territory, its military strength, and its material resources. That is, through the specific contributions that it can and wants to make to the formation of the new civilization and the new world culture that is already underway. So he doesn't say you have to be the biggest and the best. It's just like an individual. You don't have to be the biggest and the best. The way that you show up in the world as the most glorious expression of who you are is exactly that. You give expression to what's inside you, your virtues, the promise inside you. So he stressed this. And he said, a nation, even a small one and materially weak, can assert itself and receive respect and appreciation from others for what it can contribute to the common human heritage. That is, with the mission it can take on and carry out. So I'm quoting excerpts from a paper that he wrote on the synthesis of nations, which is, I find, very inspiring. And he sort of touches on what we're going to go into now. He said the fact that each nation has or may have a special mission has been recognized and affirmed also in the past. And he was really hot on Giuseppe Mazzini, because he saw Mazzini, who was a European, who saw the vision of a united Europe. And he just saw the possibility of nations coming together. So the mission of a nation is inspired by the soul. And then from that comes the recognition of the mission and the urge to carry it out. Just as when we get in touch with our own soul and our own inner self, suddenly we're on a different course. We're being motivated from a different place. We're not being motivated because we need to take from our environment. We're motivated because we got things to give. The natural urge of the soul is to give freely of the strength and the beauty and the light that is its true nature. So I find this whole notion of the synthesis of nations, sure, it's an ideal, it's a dream that he had, but it really says, if we're going to have a world that lives in peace, first of all the individuals in the human family have got to do their own work. The nations then have to realize that we are a psycho or a bio-psycho-spiritual entity, collective entity, and treat it that way. So you understand, I'm just not living in a nation. We're broadcasting from Southern California, inside the United States of America. That's a geographical location.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the psychic entity and the energetic field of this being called the USA. And I'd like to explore that in a moment. So how do we bring order to the world? Well, first of all, you bring order to self, order to your own life, order to your own nation, order to your community. And at the moment, because things are falling apart so rapidly, there is a lot of fear. And as we've said before in these podcasts, fear is the greatest force that cuts across the human creative spirit. It stymies and sort of damps down this ability to bring through the new. It's like this wet blanket of fear comes over, and therefore what you get when you have fearful, you get the rise of something that represents safety and security. When people are afraid, they need to know that they're safe. So politically, you look around the world and you have a lot of elected officials, and we know in this podcast, we don't align with any political party. We are here to support the unfoldment of the soul of each nation, the soul of each person. That's what we're here to do. Meditation Mount is here to support the evolutionary impulse through the seasons of the civilizations that happen to be right now here on the planet. And therefore, when we talk about nations, we're looking at them as communities of individual souls that have been magnetized, like iron filings called to a magnet, around the magnet of the soul of a group soul.
Mm.
So maybe, Joey, I mean, I'd like to hear some thoughts of yours before we dive into, well, let's take a look at the USA and what is it as a bio-psycho-spiritual entity. So
I just find it fascinating to think about this whole system as a one. So in the same way that you have the different organs in your body, your liver and your gallbladder are doing their things, and like in the same way, I like to think of like the Jamaican bobsled team. Like a small island nation that's got its own character, its own flavor. It does something inspiring and out of character and beautiful, but in that same sense, it's also a part of all of us. And I think that people definitely, myself included, because I'm a student of history. Anytime you think of any kind of one entity being in charge of everything, you think of when you think of like being one unified government, one unified world. It's very scary. It brings up a lot of historical kind of missteps, if you want to say. But if you think about it in terms of like just your own human body, you're not necessarily, unless something's going terribly wrong. Like I'm not generally really thinking too much about my bladder or my kidneys or whatever, what's happening in there, my lymph nodes, or unless I'm fighting off an infection, I'm not really paying much attention to them. But they're doing their own special thing all day long, and I like that when you start to look at this through the lens of the seven rays and these characters and how like it's because of the relief and the contrast of these beautiful different people and different the soul that we have this beautiful rainbow of composition. So how do we, I mean, in transitioning into the U.S., which is the melting pot, how do we have a melting pot without losing the beauty of the original components?
Right. Well, you go back to, you've got the form and you've got the indwelling life.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we get freaked out about the form.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to lose what it means to be an American.
Mm-hmm.
What it means to be an American is a spiritual note.
Right. That's actually, maybe we could linger on that for just a second, because we are in America. We are broadcasting for America. That is such an important idea, because what it means to be an American is not set in concrete. It never was. It's always been in motion, and that's what's vibrant about it. If it becomes set in stone, then that's why I think of a tombstone.
Well, what is set
Mm-hmm.
is the note,
right?
That's continually sounds.
Yeah.
How we respond to it and give it expression. That's the beauty of what happens when you bring diversity together.
Mm. Yeah.
E pluribus unum.
That's right. That's right.
That's what we're looking at. So what I'd like to do is to gently walk through a few of these nations,
Mm-hmm.
and to keep it simple. And if you want to follow up and go in depth, I would recommend that you read Alice Bailey's book on the destiny of the nations,
Mm-hmm.
Published by the Lucis Trust. You can really go deep in it. What I'm going to do is give you the cliff notes of a few of these nations,
right?
Because it's important to understand the relationship that's going on.
And this is fascinating, by the way. When I first started, I think maybe a year or two ago, you suggested looking at some of the stuff, and it is fascinating. Both like this, the system of which is created, but also like how eerily accurate everything is. And like so, it's really interesting stuff.
So what I'm going to do, so we have a formula, so we don't get lost.
Right.
I'm going to give you the soul ray. I'm going to give you the personality ray, which is the ray through which the soul expresses. Then I'm going to give you the spiritual motto, which is really the mission for each nation. And then going to do some notes on things to be careful about, things to watch.
Mm-hmm.
And so the United States of America, the soul ray is the second ray of love wisdom. So it's really a welcoming, benevolent, friendly soul that's magnetic and open.
Mm-hmm.
Its personality ray is called the sixth ray of idealism and devotion. Now, this is neither good nor bad. Devotion simply means it really is aligned to an ideal. So it's very idealistic. The American dream, everything we hear about, it's an idealistic thing. The problem is when a personality ray is operating in its positive mode as opposed to when it's operating in its negative mode. And what we're going to look at now with the USA and other nations is what is happening right now on the planet, because many of the nations are operating from, if you like, the lower aspect of their personality ray. Mm-hmm. So here you have the United States of America, second ray soul. Its personality ray is sixth ray of idealism. Its spiritual motto is, I light the way. Mm-hmm. So it has this responsibility, according to the spiritual teachings, of bringing a torch, the torch of freedom, the torch of liberty. The torch, look at the Statue of Liberty. What's the Statue of Liberty holding? It's not an ice cream cone.
That's right.
It could be, but it's not. It's the flame of liberty. Mm-hmm. I light the way. I show what's possible. So here are the notes to self when you're thinking about America. Notes to self. To develop a loving and compassionate soul-infused persona that upholds the democratic ideal while not sinking into the shadow side of the sixth ray that easily manifests as fanaticism and obstinacy. Mm. So these are my own cliff notes. So you're hearing my summation of it. But what we have to avoid here in the United States is getting fanatical. Mm-hmm. And extreme. Mm-hmm. Because idealism, when it's frozen and crystallized, only believes that its particular version of what it perceives as the ideal is that which is true.
Right.
And therefore, you've got a knockdown fight between these extreme views of what is the American ideal, the American dream. The only way to know what the American dream is to listen to the call of the soul of America. What is it calling to? What does it mean to light the way? Mm-hmm. And in order for you and I to show up in the world in our fullness, we have to grow the capacity of our personality to express the soul. We have to move out of the negative shadow side of our personality coloring into its higher aspect. So if you look at the United States, we are going through an incredible test. We've got the general election this year where these two poles are going to be in such tension. Mm-hmm. Is it going to rip us apart? Or, as we've said before, the gift of Roberto Assagioli with psychosynthesis is how do you resolve the polarities so they find a higher point of convergence, this point of synthesis? You can only do that if you recognize you're part of something greater than your part. Mm-hmm. So the test for America is to not to get fanatical and rip itself apart. Yeah. So maybe what we should do is look at Russia. Mm-hmm. Because in one respect, you'll see how Russia is different and the same. Because if you look at the soul ray of Russia, and I'm talking about Russia now, not the old Soviet Union, this is Russia. The soul ray of Russia is the seventh ray of ceremonial order and magic. It's the ray that pulls everything together. It's a synthetic ray. Its personality ray is the same ray as that of the USA.
That's right.
The sixth ray of idealism. Mm-hmm. Now, what is the spiritual motto of Russia? Its mission, I link two ways. If you look at it geographically, if you really look at the size of Russia or the old Soviet Union, it spans so many time zones. Yeah. It connects west and east. Back in the 60s, I got on a train in Helsinki, in Finland, and got off a train just south of Vladivostok on the Pacific Ocean.
Wow. Yeah.
It's a long ride.
Yeah.
It links two ways.
Yeah.
So the spiritual motto, I link two ways, is how to bring East and West together so you can find a point of synthesis again to bring the best of both East and West to a point of higher convergence.
Mm-hmm.
That's their mission, their task. And at the moment, they're struggling with their own demons, just as America is, or the USA. I don't want to say America because it's the United States of America.
Right.
Russia is struggling with its own demons. So here's my notes to self for the Russian soul. To develop the inclusive and synthetic quality of the seventh ray that can link East and West and avoid the shadow of the sixth ray persona, which expresses as fanatical cruelty.
Mm. Wow. That's it's what I meant. It's incredibly on point and accurate. It's eerily so.
So that's USA. That's Russia. Why don't we look at, let's do the trifecta and pull in China. And then we can look at a couple of, but China, I'm looking at the big players at the
heavy
moment.
hitters.
Heavy hitters. Now, here's an eye-opener. The soul ray of China is said to be the first ray of power.
Mm-hmm.
Its personality ray is the third ray of intelligence. Its spiritual motto is, I indicate the way. Now, let's go back and just look at the rays for a moment. You've got what they call the odd rays, the 1, 3, 5, 7, the hard rays.
Mm-hmm.
You've got the soft rays or the even rays, the 2, 4, 6. The 2, 4, 6 are softer. They bring in more compassion and love and openness. The other rays are harder because they bring in a particular direction.
Mm-hmm.
It's very unusual for a country to have 2 hard lines.
Mm.
So you've got the hard liners.
Right.
In China, literally,
it's
a hard line place
yes,
because you've got the first ray soul, you've got a third ray personality, and the third ray is active intelligence. It brings that power into expression. And if you look at the way it governs itself, it's 1 and 3. Absolutely. So if you like, if I could take the liberty of writing some notes to China, note to self. The task is to develop a collective heart that can demonstrate the traits of true leadership in service of the common good and offset the negative tendencies of the first and third rays towards empire building and callousness. It's just like individuals, Joey.
Yeah.
You're talking about a meta-individual now in a nation. It's a meta-individual.
Mm. Right.
It's a bio-psycho-spiritual entity.
Yeah. It's fascinating. It's fascinating.
And we're not done there.
Yeah.
So I'd like to, I didn't put it first, but let's go back to Great Britain, the UK. And I was born in the UK, and so I have some understanding, and I also have some conditioning by this. So if you look at Great Britain, the soul ray is the second ray of love wisdom. That's why there's this special relationship between the USA and Britain. Mm-hmm. We have a special relationship. Yeah, but on a soul level, they're compatible.
Mm-hmm.
Soul ray, second ray. Personality ray, first ray of power. Spiritual motto, I serve. It's interesting that the Prince of Wales, who is now the old Prince of Wales is now King Charles III.
Right.
His motto was actually in German, because if you trace back the English aristocracy basically came from Germany. Yeah. There were some members of the royal family way back in the 1800s that really didn't speak English.
Yeah.
Ich Dienst. So his motto as the Prince of Wales was I serve, and it was represented by 3 feathers, which is same as France and the fleur de lis.
Right.
So this is Trinity, this Holy Trinity. So I serve. So let's have a look at what happens when you have the second ray as a soul. It's magnanimous, it's fair, it's loving. The first ray of power of the personality means that it has to do with governance and justice. So can you imagine what happens when it's in its negative expression?
Yeah.
Colonization, imperialism. When it's functioning at its highest, it's British justice, fair play.
Right.
This commentary of fair play.
Yeah, the birth of the common law.
The Commonwealth, it's there for the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
But the Commonwealth actually was a group of nations that were taken over. But it was a benevolent, but it was, so you've got these two forces. You've got the second ray of love, wisdom, expressing through the first ray of power. And that's a very tricky one if you don't get it right, because it does tend to put you into a dominant position. You dominate.
Right.
So here's notes to self.
Yeah.
To develop a model of justice and governance based on the second ray quality of love, wisdom, and avoid the shadow side of the first ray, which can give rise to imperialism, colonialism, and an attitude of superiority. Which is, growing up in Britain, I witnessed that. Well, first of all, I didn't see it, because when you're in the water and being slowly boiled, you don't understand what's going on. But what I understood is that there's an aspect of Britain, its shadow side, that has this attitude of superiority to such an extent that it doesn't even need to say it's superior. It just assumes, of course, we're superior.
Right.
You can't do this to me, I'm British, was the classic statement. You can't do this to me, I'm British. As though that was sort of your get out of jail card, your carte blanche.
Right.
It's an incredible arrogance.
Yeah. But my first experience with that was in the touring world. There's in any decently sized musical tour, there's definitely at least a couple British nationals, and you're generally always in charge.
So anyway, I wanted to name that, because then you can see the goodness that is destined to come from a nation, but what transpires when it's still working out its personality issues. Its soul gifts cannot be given because the delivery mechanism is still not perfected. So what I'd like to do is just to take a couple more, because we could go through a whole list of these different countries. I want to do, for instance, Germany and then Italy, just to round things out.
Right.
So Germany, here's an interesting one. The soul ray of Germany is the fourth ray of harmony through conflict. So it already is, if you like, this creative battleground that eventually will give birth to beauty. I mean, look at Beethoven, Schubert, Mahler, all the music that came out of Germany, the art. Now, it has as a personality ray the first ray of power.
Yeah.
Woo.
That's a tough roll of the dice.
Yes, and its spiritual motto is, I preserve.
Interesting. That makes sense.
Yeah. So what happened here with the fourth ray of harmony through conflict is, when it couldn't express through a, if you like, mature and integrated personality, which is the first ray of power, which will give it direction and structure, it went down into its negative, which is dominance. And so you could, way back in the 60s, when the Berlin Wall went up, you had a nation that is the fourth ray of harmony through conflict. Berlin, its capital, was divided. It was split, even down to its physical, its physicality.
Yeah.
So if I was to be bold enough to say notes to self to the German soul, to maintain balance and harmony through periods of conflict that may arise nationally or globally, and to avoid the negative aspect of the first ray that tends to dominate, as witnessed by the rise and fall of the Third Reich. I mean, that, if you want a lesson in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Yeah, not easy, not easy. So I think that's pretty obvious that when you see a nation like Germany, you see its strength and you see the beauty coming through. And then when it doesn't have its act together, it can unleash on the world just utter dominance.
Yeah.
You know, suddenly they're invading Poland.
Right.
In the 30s. And because there was this dream of creating harmony.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there was this dream of the German soul of creating harmony, not just musical, but actually bringing all things together. Well, how do you do that? Well, you create, if you like, in its distorted sense, you create the Third Reich.
Yeah.
And through the personality of a first ray, you go do it. Nothing's holding you back. It's a very, very tricky one. So if we're going to then just take one more, because we could keep going on this. I want to take Italy because I have a deep love for Italy, but also Italy played an important role in the last Renaissance. So let's have a look at what gave rise to that. The soul ray of Italy is called the sixth ray of idealism. Here we go back. So there is a connection with the soul of Italy and the personality of both Russia and the USA.
Yeah.
Its personality ray is the fourth ray of harmony through conflict. And its spiritual motto is, I carve the paths. I carve the paths. It's to create new paths. But I carve, I mean, you think of Michelangelo and the Renaissance and what came out of that. Because the personality ray, the fourth ray, is what creates beauty. It is the ray of the artist. And the ray of idealism at the soul level is exactly that.
Yeah.
You are creating this ideal. What was Michelangelo's carving of David all about? It was this ideal model. And the story is he then removed everything from the marble, this block of marble that didn't represent the ideal, the not self. And what was revealed through Michelangelo's artistry was this manifested ideal. And that's what a statue is. It's a manifested representation of an inner idea or ideal. So when you see in Italy this incredible beauty, and what I love about the way the Italians design their cars, design their coffee makers, the Germans have fantastic engineering.
Yeah.
So what the Italians do is they take that great engineering and they add flair.
Yeah. Yes, they do. And it's beautiful.
And I mean, Italian suits, if you're looking at clothing, well, the French and Italian, there's a certain elegance to it. So what I've noticed with Italy, it's a very, very friendly place, because if you go back to the soul ray and the personality, they're both soft rays. They're both even. 6 and a 4. Whereas China it's a hardline country with a 1 and a 3.
Yeah.
So 6 and a 4, yeah. Where's the discipline? Where's the structure? Mañana. Yeah. This is the siesta time. Everything has a looseness to it, and yet it functions.
Right.
And it holds together because it has this idealism, this desire to express an ideal, and also because it has this gift of a fourth ray personality that seems to be able to create beauty out of everything. And if you look at the Italian landscape, it's a collection of different forms of beauty. From the the far north, the Südtirol kind of Bavarian influence, right down to the heart of Italy with Umbria and Tuscany, right down south to Sicily.
Yeah.
And Sicily, of course, was where the Greeks came in. And also from North Africa, you had influences. So Sicily is a very interesting entry point for culture, and it runs all the way up. Runs all the way up into Italy. So Italy is a very interesting geographical shape. It's very narrow, and it's got the greatest amount of coastline compared to the sort of the landmass.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Which is interesting because it goes back to emotion and the sixth ray and water. So Italy is a very beautiful place. And I believe a new renaissance will come out of Italy as well. There is going to be an uprising again of beauty. And each nation is being called to express its soul note at this time. Unfortunately, two things are happening. One, the nation has not created a receptive field that can be open to impression from the soul. It's not listening for soul impression. It's caught up in what it believes its beliefs are. It's crystallizing those beliefs, and it is playing out the extremes. So whether that's USA, whether that's Russia, whether that's Great Britain, we're in this incredible tug of war between the pull of the soul and the gravitational encumbrance of a personality that is not yet liberated and free to serve the highest good of its nation. And therefore, the nation is not able at this time to serve the highest good of the planet, the human family. So we go back to Roberto Assagioli's synthesis of nations. It's going to be very difficult to move towards the synthesis of nations until each nation has got its act together. So maybe that's a good stopping point. There's a couple of other things I'd like to cover, but just as far as looking at nations as bio, psycho, spiritual, collective entities.
Yeah.
So what strikes you, Joey?
I mean, I think we could spend all day. I'm just fascinated with how you even come to these classifications, what's the nuts and bolts of this whole thing, and but I do think it's also very interesting to sort of view like the entity of the soul of a nation through this lens, and I think it can be actually really helpful in moving forward. I think it's only useful if it's helpful, and this is incredibly helpful, I think.
Well, it's useful because it shows that there is diversity. A one world government is not a uniformity. Or one world government, when in its benevolence, is how we agree to live and govern ourselves collectively as a human species.
Right.
That's all it is. Now, we immediately go to the dark side and think it's an imposition of rule by one part over the whole, which at the moment it probably would be.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this whole vision of synthesis and the synthesis of the nations that Roberto Assagioli held, because I met this early on, because I was privileged to know and meet and spend time with Roberto Assagioli in my early years and be mentored. I came into contact later in the late 70s, and Roberto Assagioli died in 1974. I came into contact with an organization that was an NGO, a non-governmental organization attached to the UN in New York called Planetary Citizens. And a good friend and mentor of mine, Donald Keyes, was the founder. And he did a lot of work behind the scenes at the UN. He used to write speeches for some of the delegates. And he did each year, he did an annual report on the voting record of all the nations, basically saying, how are they performing? Were they being good people?
Yeah.
or were they voting in their own self-interest against the interest of the common good? Anyway, he worked with U Thant, who was from Burma, or as it was called at that time, Siam, Burma. He was the former Secretary General of the United Nations. And in one of his speeches, he declared that each person needs to have a second allegiance. So he said, in addition to being a citizen of your country, you also need to be a citizen of the planet. He wasn't saying dump or ditch your nationality. He was saying place your nationality into a larger context. So Donald Keyes was deeply moved by this and created an organization called Planetary Citizens. And its motto was one Earth, one humanity, one destiny. One Earth, one humanity, one destiny. And what we did is it was an educational program. We also produced out of the UN, unofficially, but with an official UN stamp, planetary passports, which you presented alongside your national passport to show that not only am I a citizen of this nation, I'm also a planetary citizen.
Yeah.
And these were issued by the UN. I don't know how he did it. And for some people, it was an amazing adventure. They would present 2 passports, and whoever was at the passport control either was intrigued and saying, well, this is interesting. Yes, I'll put a stamp in it. Or they get thrown in jail.
Yeah.
Because,
Yeah.
They didn't realize, they thought this person was just out to make trouble. So what it was doing was testing the readiness of nationality to see itself as an aspect of a greater whole, rather than nationality as an isolated unit inside this barren landscape called the world.
Yeah.
And our task is to make our nation the best possible in opposition to, rather than each one of us attempting to make ourselves the best possible version of Joey or Michael so that we can be of service.
Yeah, that's right. That's the big.
That's the differentiator here. When the locus of the life of a nation or an individual shifts from self-orientation and selfishness to serving the good of the whole. And I guess that's really the bottom line for this podcast, is understanding that we're here as aspects of the one. Not just as individuals, but as nations, we're aspects of one humanity. And it's how at the moment we incarnate the spirit of humanity through the various nations. Now, the nations may change, they may dissolve, they may disappear, because we've reached a point of synthesis where we incarnate as one collective unit in different geographical areas with different cultures. So we don't get rid of the culture. But what we don't do is allow the nation to become the dominant aspect in the world, on the world stage. No nation has superiority. No individual has superiority. The sovereign self of an individual and of a nation has to be honored as a vital aspect of the one humanity. If you don't have this one earth, one humanity, one destiny, which was the Planetary Citizens motto, you're never going to reach this point of synthesis. And if you don't reach a point of synthesis, you will never reach the flowering of the golden age of the species of humanity. And that, for me, is the bottom line, Joey.
That's it right there. That's the golden thread. That's a beautiful place to wrap. So, thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Joey.
All right. I'll see you.
Okay.